The church bells on the outskirts of Geneva echoed as the heavy iron gates of the Montclair estate creaked shut. Footsteps hurried across the cold marble floor, trailed by silhouettes draped in elegant black coats. The air of mourning had not yet lifted, but anticipation was already replacing grief. Everyone knew there was still one secret left in this house: the will of billionaire Edouard Montclair. The grand living room shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, but even that light couldn't dispel the chill. Antique paintings on the walls mirrored the tense faces of blood heirs. Isabelle Montclair Reinhardt, 46, her hair pulled into a tight bun and a string of pearls gleaming at her neck, sat at the center. Her gaze was sharp as a blade, cold as if auditing the entire room. Beside her, her husband Henrik Reinhardt, a seasoned financial broker, wore the composed smile of a man accustomed to manipulation through charming words. Across from them lounged Julien Montclair, the eldest son, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his sun-kissed skin hinting at extravagant holidays. He tapped his fingers on the armrest, eyes glinting not with sorrow, but impatience for the figures he hoped to hear in the will. Amira Diallo was sitting apart at the end of the long table, almost swallowed by the grandeur. A simple dark coat enveloped her thin frame. Her sun-darkened, calloused hands shaped by years of cleaning and caregiving clutched an old fabric bag tightly. Her expression was calm, but her eyes remained lowered, avoiding the judgmental stares. No one in that luxurious room could fathom. She was the one who knew every inch of the estate: the third stair that creaked underfoot, the window that caught the sun precisely at 4 p.m., and the kettle that whistled exactly at 82 degrees, just as the master had demanded. A sharp metallic sound broke the silence. Hans Keller, the family's longtime attorney, adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and held a thick envelope sealed with red wax. He laid it on the mahogany table as delicately as if placing a bomb capable of shattering the fragile peace in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Keller cleared his throat, "as per the wishes of Mr. Edouard Montclair, I will now read the full will, including all appendices and accompanying letters." No one spoke, but tension hung like invisible wires tightening around them. Isabelle leaned slightly forward, her voice frosty. "Kindly skip the unnecessary formalities. My father despised long-windedness." Keller nodded, slowly sliding a metal blade beneath the envelope's flap, breaking the seal. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, every gaze greedy, wary, anxious, fixed on him. Amira clutched the bag to her chest, her heart pounding. She felt like she was walking into a storm, unsure if she was its center or just a bystander. Then Keller unfolded the document. The air thickened, bracing for the shock that would forever alter the fate of everyone in the room. Hans Keller began to read. His voice was as steady as a Swiss clock, but each word struck the air like nails driven into wood. "I, Edouard Montclair, in full possession of my faculties, hereby divide my estate as follows." The opening lines were modest bequests: a scholarship fund for his old boarding school in Lausanne, a donation to the hospital where he once received treatment, and a few mementos for lifelong friends. Julien rolled his eyes repeatedly. Clearly bored, Isabelle held her posture, but the corners of her mouth began to twitch. Henrik discreetly scribbled something into a small notebook, likely running percentage calculations. No one noticed Amira, the only woman in the room who wasn't waiting for her turn. She listened, as if hearing the final notes of a song she knew by heart. Then Keller paused. His hand rested on a particular paragraph, his eyes rising, then lowering again. His voice slowed, each syllable deliberate. "All shares of my holdings in Montclair Industries, the Montclair estate, my properties in Zermatt and Capri, and the entirety of the assets in the trust bearing my name I bequeath to my employee and caregiver, Amira Diallo." There was silence for several seconds. Then, "What?" Julien shot up as if electrocuted. His chair clattered to the marble floor, echoing through the room. "This is a joke, a social experiment, a hidden camera prank?" Isabelle didn't move. Her face was taut, porcelain-like. Lips pressed pale and tight, her eyes darkened. Henrik's expression remained calm, but his writing hand froze mid-note. "Reread it," Isabelle said, not loudly, not quickly, but in the tone of a judge issuing a verdict. Keller showed no emotion. He turned the page back and read the line, word for word. "The entirety of the assets in the trust bearing my name, I bequeath to Amira Diallo." The air thickened. From the corner, The old grandfather clock, which had stopped since yesterday, gave a single, dry click. Julian threw up his hands, shouting, "My father would never do this. He knew me. Knew you spent more time on yachts than at his bedside." Isabel cut in coldly, eyes still fixed on Keller. Henrik laid down his pen. A faint smile flickered across his face. "Mr. Keller, with all due respect, can you confirm that Mr. Montclair was of sound mind when he signed this?" Keller responded without hesitation. The document was reviewed and reaffirmed 8 months ago, accompanied by full medical assessments attesting to his mental clarity, notarized and verified by both a physician and a legal witness. At the far end of the table, Amira remained silent. Her hands trembled slightly, but stayed neatly folded over her bag. She offered no protest, no apology, no explanation. Isabel turned to Keller, speaking slowly. "I was told there is also a letter?" "There is," Keller replied. "However, per Mr. Montclair's explicit instructions, the letter will be read only after. Miss Amira has privately listened to a personal recording. This condition is mandatory and non-negotiable." Julian barked. "Right here. Play it now. Let's get to the final act if this is a play." Keller looked to Amira. "It's your choice. We can arrange for you to listen to it in my office if you prefer." Amira lifted her head. In that brief moment, she could almost see her late employer sitting in his favorite armchair by the window, holding his teacup, smiling softly. "Knight to F3, Amira. Strike in silence." "Play it," she said. "I'll listen. Here." A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Isabel gave a short laugh. "Of course. The leading lady must take the stage." Keller nodded and stepped out. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. Amira immediately recognized the old pen and recorder case Mr. Edouard kept in his desk drawer. "Miss Amira, are you ready?" Amira gave a slight nod. Keller pressed the button. There was a short crackle, and then the room filled with a husky but unmistakable voice. "Amira, if you're hearing this, it means my hands can no longer lift the teacup at precisely 5:12 p.m. Edouard's voice came through slow, each word heavy like a pebble dropped into a still lake. No one dared interrupt. "I can say this now because I'm no longer there to look into their eyes, to see the frowns, to hear the whispers behind my back. But I must say it, not for money, for honor, and for gratitude." Amira raised a hand to her lips. Her eyes widened, but didn't blink. Her lips were parched. "I didn't choose you because I pitied you, Amira. I chose you because you were there when everyone else vanished. When my hand trembled, you held the pen. When I forgot my words, you read them to me. When I felt small within this decaying body, you called me by my name, not sir. I lived like a king, but only you treated me like a man." Julian shook his head and dropped his face into his hands. Isabel closed her eyes, fingers clenched so tight they turned white. Henrik sat motionless like a statue, no phone, no notebook, just watching Amira. "I know Isabel has a child. Julian loves the son more than duty. I don't blame them. But I cannot entrust everything to those who only return for the inheritance. I didn't write this to punish. I wrote it so that I could reward care for the first time in my life." Amira trembled. Her breath was uneven, but her gaze remained locked on the recorder, as if staring into the returning soul of someone departed. "I don't need you to cling to these assets like a vault. I need you to guard them the way you held my arm each time I almost fell in the hallway. Steady, without flaunting." A pause. The sound of waves seemed to echo from somewhere far away. Then, "You know what you must do. I've seen it in your eyes these past years." Keller stopped the tape. No one moved. The chandelier above swayed gently, as though the entire house had exhaled after a final confession. Silence held, until Isabel finally spoke, her voice no longer proud, just taut. "Touching. Truly. But it doesn't change that she's a maid." The word maid was pulled back, leaving a blank space. Henrik grasped his wife's hand, but his eyes were still razor sharp. "Mr. Keller, wasn't this will sign during a severe decline in Mr. Edouard's health?" "No," Keller answered firmly. "He signed it the same week he approved the Houston expansion project, a contract Mrs. Isabel also co-signed. Both documents carry matching medical certifications. Julian shot to his feet. And what about us? Are we nothing to him? We're his children. Yes, Isabel said quietly. We did what we could. Amira looked at them. Then, for the first time, she spoke. Last Christmas he was here, alone. I set the table. Reheated the turkey twice. Read A Christmas Carol to him. And you, Isabel bit her lip. You texted, change of plans. Zermatt is beautiful. And you, she nodded at Julian, posted a photo from a yacht in Saint-Tropez. Henrik exhaled sharply. Amira glanced toward the empty armchair by the fireplace. He cried like a child. Quietly. I held his hand, not knowing what to say. I just kept thinking about how the tea had gone cold. Keller cleared his throat. There is still a letter. But it comes with a condition. Another condition? Isabel snapped. This is absurd. Not at all, Mrs. Montclair Reinhardt, Keller replied calmly. Mr. Edouard wanted Miss Amira to decide. If she wishes, I will read the letter here. If not, it will remain sealed until it is opened at my office, in the presence of legal counsel. All eyes turned to Amira. She looked again at the armchair, as if seeking an invisible nod. Then she turned back, inhaled deeply. I want it read. Today. But quietly. No one demeaned. No one is performing. Isabel let out a cold laugh. No performance? That's rich. No performance, Amira repeated. But this time, her voice was solid as stone. Lawyer Hans Keller opened the second envelope. The paper inside carried the distinct scent of dry ink, written on elegant stationery with the same steady, familiar handwriting. He skimmed the content briefly, then gently laid the letter on the wooden table, placing his hands on the arms of his chair as though speaking to a long-lost friend. His voice dropped, solemn. To my dear Amira, if you're hearing these words, I am likely no longer here to thank you the way I always wished I could. This inheritance, more than material, is my way of righting a wrong in this world. A world that taught me blood is more important than kindness, and that the wealthy are always more deserving than the ones who serve. A soft breath escaped from Amira. But you know I've always believed this. Wealth without purpose is no different than a chessboard without pieces. So I leave this legacy not to be kept, but to continue living through the things you will do. Isabel crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. Julian grimaced, as though each word grated against his pride. Keep the Montclair estate as a home, not a museum. Let the gardens bloom as I once loved the scent of jasmine in April, the purple hue of lavender in June. Reopen the library, where I once read poetry with your mother, so the children of Geneva may learn without being driven away by silence and coldness. Continue visiting the children's hospital, the one I supported once a week, and keep those afternoon teas exactly at 5:12 as a habit of living kindly. A pause. And finally, take my ashes to Porto Venere, the cliffside where the waves sound like classical music. Bring the old man and the sea. Read it aloud, even if only the wind is listening. Amira clutched her bag to her chest. Keller paused his reading, then spoke clearly. This is the accompanying list of duties. If all are completed within 6 months, the entirety of the estate, including the trust, will be transferred in full. If not, everything will revert to an international charitable foundation managed by a third party. No member of the Montclair family will receive anything. Henrik froze. Isabel sprang up. 6 months? Tasks? What is this, a sentimental game? Julian scoffed. A field trip to scatter ashes is now a legal clause? This is ridiculous. Keller remained composed. It's not a ridiculous clause. It is a clear, lawful condition of the will. Then buzz. 3 chimes rang from the estate's intercom system. A security guard entered, hesitant, and whispered into Henrik's ear. Henrik paled. No. It can't be. Isabel turned sharply to her husband. What is it? The press. They already know. And more. Henrik swallowed. The bank has initiated verification procedures. The trust will be frozen if the conditions aren't met on time. Julian slammed the table. What kind of game is this? What kind of legacy is this? Keller lifted the letter, his eyes gleaming with something almost like satisfaction. It is the way Mr. Edouard Montclair chose to end the final chapter of his life, with something straightforward: justice for compassion. After the letter was read, the atmosphere in the Montclair estate shifted. No longer draped in mourning, nor restrained by civility, each heir retreated to their corner, but their eyes still sparred in silence. In Edouard's old study, once reserved only for confidential meetings and urgent decisions, Isabelle, Julien, and Henrik sat in a tense triangular formation, facing the man who had entered through the side door. Marcus Lang, clad in a pale gray suit and deep navy tie, with a calm demeanor like the hush before a storm. Marcus was a seasoned international attorney, a specialist in complex inheritance disputes, especially when the family had ceased to be the central force. Henrik spoke first, low and razor-sharp. "We don't intend to let the entire Montclair estate fall into the hands of a maid." Isabelle continued, her gaze cold as steel. "My father was emotionally compromised, weak, vulnerable, and she was always by his side." Marcus folded his hands. Deliberate. "There's no evidence Mr. Montclair lacked mental capacity. As you heard, all documents are certified and sound." Julien growled. "So what do we do? Sit back while she waters the garden, reopens the library, reads books to a jar of ashes, and laughs in our faces?" Marcus opened his case file and withdrew a document. "The only way to overturn the will is to prove that one of the conditions has been violated." Henrik leaned forward. "You mean, if she fails one of the tasks?" "Precisely," Marcus smirked. "If even one of the conditions is unmet, not on time, not according to the specified process, the entire inheritance reverts to the charity, irrevocably." Isabelle looked out the window, where the garden had begun to shed its leaves. Then she said, "There's no need for moral debates or emotional arguments." Her eyes swept over the withering petals. "We just need one misstep." Meanwhile, Amira sat alone at the kitchen table in the back wing of the estate. Before her lay a worn, leather-bound notebook and an old fountain pen. She began writing the tasks, line by line, with the care of an artist sketching. Tend the Montclair gardens. Reopen the library for Geneva's youth. Volunteer at the Children's Hospital weekly. Scatter the ashes at Porto Venere, and read The Old Man and the Sea. Afternoon tea at 5:12. Keep the ritual. Her hand paused at the final line. A single tear dropped onto the page, but was quickly wiped away with a sleeve. That night, she lay awake. The breeze from the garden slipped in through the cracked window, carrying a soft whistle like Edouard's whisper. "Amira, this isn't a test. This is trust." Amira was preparing a teapot the next morning when footsteps echoed from the hallway. Julien entered, a sweater draped over his shoulders, and his voice lit as if wishing someone a happy birthday. "Good morning. It seems you've got a lot on your plate: gardening, managing a library, and running charity programs. Quite the career advancement." Amira said nothing. She stirred her tea. "But it's tiring, isn't it?" He tilted his head, eyes glinting with mockery. "You know, the world is tough for someone not born into it. Just one little mistake, and everything could turn." Amira set the spoon down gently, not out of fear but because she had heard such threats her entire life. Only this time, it came from someone who shared the name of her late employer. "At least," she replied, "I won't be bored." Julien smirked, but his eyes had lost their charm. Before leaving, he turned. "Good luck, Madame Diallo. You'll need more than kindness to survive these 6 months." Amira returned to her teapot. But deep inside, she already knew. The game had begun, and the board no longer belonged to Edouard. It belonged to her. 1 week later, a cold rain fell over Geneva. Amira exited a taxi in front of Cantonal Children's Hospital, carrying a canvas bag filled with comic books, handmade toys, and a notebook labeled Montclair Legacy Library for Children Under Care. At the reception desk, the young attendant looked up, a flicker of unease in her eyes. "I'm sorry. Your name isn't on this week's volunteer list." Amira frowned slightly. "Could you check again?" "I registered regularly every Wednesday at 2 p.m. The receptionist tapped again on her keyboard, then shook her head. "Your registration was canceled yesterday. Reason: internal request. No notice, no warning, just erased." Amira glanced at the clock. 1:56 p.m. If she didn't enter today, it would mark a missed week, And if someone out there was waiting for that moment, she couldn't let them win. A familiar voice called from behind, right on time as always. She turned. Dr. Eric Muller, head of pediatrics and longtime friend of Edouard. His salt and pepper hair was dotted with raindrops, but his smile radiated warmth like wool in winter. There's been a little mix-up with your paperwork. I've heard whispers, he said quietly. But today, we don't need to be overly bureaucratic. He pulled out his physician's badge and swiped it at the security door. Come with me. I'll take full responsibility. Amira bowed her head slightly in gratitude. She stepped into the hospital corridor, clutching her bag, with only one thought in mind. Don't let them take this. Not for Edouard, but for the children waiting inside. At the same time, Marcus Lang sat across from Henrik in a sleek glass office at Montclair Industries. A fresh document lay on the table. Third-party report. Suspected procedural irregularity during first week of charitable duties. Henrik flipped through the pages. If she doesn't make it into that hospital today, we can file a motion to request an audit of the entire will's execution. Marcus nodded. The chances are slim, but one slip is all we need to trigger the freeze clause. And that's the first step toward reopening the inheritance dispute. Henrik sipped his espresso, the corner of his mouth curling. It's begun. By late afternoon, Amira sat beside 8-year-old Andre, a leukemia patient. Can you read another one? He whispered, voice hoarse. She opened a book, reading each line with soft character voices. Other children turned their heads to listen. Beneath the warm yellow light, Amira was no longer an heir. She was just a woman reading stories, bringing joy to those who needed. As she left, Dr. Mueller pressed an envelope into her hand. A signed confirmation that you completed your volunteer hours today, just in case. Someone asks for proof. Amira nodded. She understood now. This wasn't a humanitarian mission. This was war. That night, back at the Montclair estate, Amira entered the study. On the desk were receipts, photographs, and schedules, evidence she had begun gathering like a general charting a battlefield. Suddenly she paused. In the drawer, a strange folder. She opened it. Dozens of handwritten letters. All from her. To Edouard. Thank you for the Darjeeling tea. It reminded me of my mother. Happy birthday. I've placed the lavender vase in the reading room. I read The Railway Children yesterday. You fell asleep right when the main character found her brother. At the end of the bundle was a thicker envelope, marked in Edouard's familiar hand. Only open when you begin to doubt yourself. Amira didn't open it. She placed it back carefully. But something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just chosen. She had been prepared. Saturday morning. The early winter sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the Montclair Library. For the first time in decades, the grand room was open again. No dust veiled the mahogany shelves. No signs read, "Do not enter without permission." Wearing soft cotton gloves, Amira moved slowly, wiping each surface and each book spine. She wasn't just cleaning, she was rekindling a memory. Mornings when Mr. Edouard sat in his rocking chair reading Proust, while she swept the floors lightly so as not to interrupt his thoughts. By midday, she was arranging children's books on a freshly labeled shelf specially reserved for local elementary students when a knock echoed on the heavy wooden door. A curly-haired girl in a navy uniform peeked inside. "Can I read in here, miss?" Amira smiled gently. "This is exactly why this place was reopened, my dear." The girl ran in, followed by 2 friends. They picked out books and curled into armchairs like they had always belonged there. Amira sat behind the librarian's desk where Edouard once scribbled notes in book margins and noticed an old wooden box. Inside, a black leather notebook and several reels of old film. She pulled out the notebook and recognized her handwriting, faded with time. The 11th of March. He couldn't eat breakfast, so he replaced it with ginger tea. The 22nd of June. His left eye weakened, moved the reading lamp slightly to the right. The 24th of December. He said nothing, just held my hand in silence. Tiny things, never recorded in medical reports, never mentioned in headlines, but they were evidence of real presence. A thicker envelope, sealed with deep red wax, is at the very bottom. On its surface, the familiar, careful, and resolute handwriting, only open when you begin to doubt yourself. Amira held it in her hand, and for a moment, it felt like Edouard was right there with her. A part of her wanted to open it. Another part Did not. She returned it to the second drawer and locked it with the brass key. She didn't need to read it, not yet. Across the street, at a cafe overlooking the estate, Marcus Lang sat with Henrik and Julian. Laid out before them, candid photos of Amira at the hospital, her library schedule, charity paperwork. Marcus pushed forward a new folder. She's meticulous. Every step backed by receipts, every action with a certificate. Henrik frowned. What about Porto Venere? Marcus smirked. She hasn't gone yet. But I've filed a request with the Italian Coastal Preservation Agency. We'll have the area marked as temporarily restricted. One administrative slip, and the whole trust gets frozen. Julian narrowed his eyes. All it takes is one misstep. A missing permit, a late arrival, and boom. That night, Amira sat in the study, updating her notebook. She reviewed every receipt, every document. She knew they were watching. They didn't just want her to fail. They were building a trap. She paused at the final line. Porto Venere, permit request filed with Italian Customs Authority on the 3rd of November. Confirmation of receipt, the 5th of November. She set down her pen. And for the first time since the will was read, she smiled. Not because she was winning, but because she understood something now. Edouard hadn't given her tasks, he had given her trust. And that trust, no one had the right to destroy. Early morning, the clouds drifted like smoke over the Ligurian peaks. Amira sat behind the wheel of a silver Lancia sedan, the same car she used to polish every Saturday morning for Mr. Edouard, under the eaves of the Montclair estate. An ebony urn wrapped in a gray silk scarf rested on the passenger seat. In the back were a French edition of The Old Man and the Sea, and a charcoal gray wool scarf Edouard always wore on winter afternoons. Destination: Porto Venere, the seaside town in northwestern Italy, where cliffs fell into the deep blue like eternal walls. The place where Edouard had once dreamed of hearing a book read to him, one last time. No music, only the sound of tires on asphalt and the wind seeping through the slightly open window, and in Amira's mind memories of hospital nights, holding his hand, reading Hemingway aloud, line by line, calmly. Knight to F3, Amira. Don't attack with anger, strike with silence. When she arrived, the sky was crystal clear. The sea stirred gently, waves curling up against the rocks like they were brushing the edge of memory. She walked across the stones to the high wall overlooking the sea, the spot Edouard once described as where one feels small, gently. She placed the urn down, wrapped the gray scarf around her neck, a final offering of warmth. We've arrived, she whispered. She opened the book. The wind flipped a few pages. Then, she began to read. No rush, no tears. Hemingway's words rose into the air, blending with the waves. It felt as if even the ocean paused to listen. A sharp whistle pierced the air behind her as she finished the final page. Two men in dark coats approached, silver insignias gleaming on their chests. The taller one held out an official document. Miss Amira Diallo. We are from the Italian Coastal Conservation Agency. We've received a report that you may be conducting an unauthorized ash scattering ceremony in a restricted zone. Amira remained calm, though a tightness coiled in her chest. From a distance, a familiar black car pulled up. The door opened. Marcus Lang stepped out, coat crisp, hands in pockets, his smirk as sharp as ever. Unfortunate, he said coolly. It's all very touching. But unfortunately, no one is above the law. The officials nodded. We must ask you to stop. Without the proper permits, ash dispersal here constitutes an environmental violation. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes like razors. Under the seal clause, the trust freezes if this final condition is not met. Amira said nothing. She calmly reached into her bag and pulled out a clear plastic folder. Inside a white envelope with a red official seal, Permit 14799HB, issued by the Italian Coastal Resource Authority. Signed by Director Paolo Ferroni. Submitted by Dr. Eric Müller on my behalf. Confirmed on the 5th of this month. Valid for 72 hours from today. One officer scanned the digital record on a tablet. A green light flashed. Fully authorized, Mr. Lang. Marcus froze. The smirk vanished. His eyes were shards of broken glass. We'll follow up on this later. Amira gave a slight nod. You still have the right to leave. And I have the right to stay. Marcus turned sharply, returned to his car, and shut the door. Amira turned back toward the sea. The wind still blew, but it no longer stung. She took the urn and opened the lid. Gently, as if returning someone to the wind, she tilted it. Ashes floated into the air, mingling with the waves like smoke disappearing into the horizon. Before leaving, she reached into her bag and took out the wax-sealed envelope. Only open when you begin to doubt yourself. This time, she opened it. Inside, a short handwritten letter and a black USB drive. The note made her breath catch. If you've made it here, love has overcome anger. Share this recording. Let the world understand why. She looked out at the ocean, a place where all words became whispers. She held the USB tight in her hand, and she knew with absolute clarity, the battle was not over. The next morning, Geneva lay under a veil of pale gray mist that had draped the old city in solemn anticipation. The Montclair Library opened earlier than usual. On the stone steps, reporters, lawyers, locals, and even a few politicians stood waiting. Everyone knew something was about to be revealed. Inside, Amira sat in the front row, a thin envelope in hand, eyes fixed on the speakers mounted high on the walls. Beside her, lawyer Hans Keller plugged the small black USB into the central sound system. Isabel and Julian arrived late, entering with Marcus Lang. None of them spoke. Henrik was absent, perhaps knowing this recording could shatter every legal strategy he'd been crafting behind the scenes. Keller stepped to the wooden podium. Ladies and gentlemen, as per the explicit request of the late Mr. Edouard Montclair, we will now play his final audio message recorded during his last week of life. He pressed the button. Edouard's voice emerged, aged, gravelly but firm. If you're hearing this, I wanted to end everything in my voice. No lawyer speaks truth better than the one who lived it. Isabel, Julian, I once loved you the way I thought a father should. With education, opportunities, power, and freedom. But Amira, the world gave you almost nothing, yet you showed me what no one else did, presence. On Christmas you were away. You were traveling. When I had a fever, you sent assistance. Amira held my hand when I couldn't speak and stayed with me through the night. Amira gripped the envelope tighter, but her head remained high. The room had fallen completely silent, a reverence that felt like the inside of a cathedral. This is not punishment. This is a reward, and that reward has nothing to do with blood. It has everything to do with who kept my heart. Julian lowered his head. Isabel closed her eyes. Marcus stared at the speaker as though willing the words to catch fire. I leave this library with one condition. Amira must keep it open to the public for free, for life. No selling, closing, turning it into a cold monument. Whispers erupted from the press section. Several journalists began typing rapidly. Some will say, I was manipulated. If so, ask the night nurse. Ask the 3 a.m. shift doctor. Ask the guard who saw who leave my room each night. They will tell you the truth. A pause. Then Edouard's voice returned, slower, thick with emotion. If anyone asks why an old man left an empire to a housemaid, tell them, because he knew who was truly there for him when he was no longer an empire. Keller turned off the recording. The entire library was silent. Not the silence of politeness, but the kind of silence left behind when the last mask falls. Amira didn't look at anyone. She turned her gaze instead to the large window where the Montclair garden was beginning to bloom with early lavender. Keller nodded and declared, "The will shall stand. All conditions have been fulfilled. The Montclair estate and its trust will be transferred to Miss Amira Diallo by Mr. Montclair's wishes." Julian stood abruptly, muttering something under his breath, and walked out. Isabel followed, her heels striking the stone floor like a metronome of retreat. Marcus Lang was the last to remain. He stared at Amira as if trying to decipher something from her calm expression. But there was nothing to decipher. She hadn't won. She had kept a promise. Marcus left without a word. Amira rose and walked toward the window. Behind her, rows of chairs emptied. Before her, the Montclair Library remained bathed in midday light, casting long streaks of blue, red, gold, and violet across the stone floor through the stained glass. In the glass, the faint reflection of Edouard's armchair appeared, where he used to sit with the gray scarf over his shoulders, reading the paper. She could almost see him now, head tilted, a faint smile. Knight to F3. Amira. A quiet move, but devastating. She placed her hand on the window pane, then stepped back. Outside, For the first time in weeks of rain, the sun broke through the clouds. 3 days later, all of Geneva was abuzz. Major newspapers Le Matin, Tribune de Genève, La Presse Européenne featured the same headline: the housemaid who inherited the Montclair empire. A testament to humanity or a blow to the elite. On social media, millions had already shared Edouard Montclair's final audio recording. The most viral quote, clipped and hashtagged across platforms was, "I knew who stood beside me when I was no longer an empire." No one argued about the money. They argued about care, about presence, about the question that shook the social conscience. Is blood worth more than loyalty? At the Montclair estate, winter no longer felt so cold. Under Amira's care, the garden had begun to bloom again, vivid lavender, pure white jasmine, and the scent of ginger tea drifting from the small kitchen precisely at 5:12 p.m. The Montclair Library is open daily. Children lined up to read. Students came to study, and in a quiet corner by the fireplace stood Edouard's favorite armchair left untouched, beside a wooden plaque that read, "Not to sit, to remember." Amira hadn't changed much. Still wore her gray wool coat. Still had the same hands that once dusted every doorframe. But one thing had changed entirely: the way people looked at her. No longer from above, but with respect. One late afternoon, a young woman stepped in hesitantly as Amira folded books at the librarian's desk. "Excuse me, I'm from Nairobi. I heard your story on the radio. I want to become a librarian in my village. Could you tell me how to begin?" Amira smiled. She gently touched the old man and the sea, then opened the first page. "Start by reading a book to someone who can't." Elsewhere in the city, Isabelle Montclair sat alone in a silent office at her newly formed investment firm, no longer bearing her father's name, no longer backed by the family trust. On her desk, a rejected loan application. Julien had quietly left Geneva, retreating to a seaside villa in Spain. No more magazine covers. No more conferences. As for Marcus Lang, after his public defeat, he vanished from the legal circuit. Rumors swirled that investors had dropped him for one simple reason: he had chosen the wrong side of the story. Back at the library, Amira opened the desk drawer. Inside was the wax-sealed envelope, the very first letter from Edouard, and a note she had once written: "Thank you for letting me care for you until the end." She placed both into a small wooden box, locked it, and set it on the highest shelf in the library, the spot where the afternoon sunlight always hits first. Then she walked toward the door, not rushing, not hiding. She paused and looked back at the house that was no longer a mansion. It had become a home of kindness. Above Geneva, the sky blazed with sunlight. High overhead, a flock of sparrows crossed the horizon, drawing a line between memory and hope.